On this episode of Shareable Science Beyond the Blog, we've got a sampler platter of stories, from information about vaccines to risks about reinfection.
Welcome to Shareable Science. Science you can share.
We're going to go for breadth versus depth in today's video. I've got 5 stories that I want to give you quick updates on, but we're going to just make them that, quick updates. First one is a study of over 178,000 blood samples that were provided across the nation for clinical purposes like cholesterol or thyroid screening. Nothing at all to do with COVID-19, but those samples were tested for the presence of antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And the results varied from state to state, which makes sense. New York State was the highest, for example, but in general, about 10% across the nation of samples came back with antibodies for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So a couple of important caveats. The samples that are collected for this kind of clinical study, I'm having my cholesterol tested, don't necessarily mimic the entire United States population. And this was done in the July to September timeframe before the big spike in numbers we saw in October and November. But even if we take all that into account, as a nation, we're still likely a long way away from herd immunity and having enough people with protection that we are able to protect other individuals. That brings us to our second point. An additional way that we achieve that is by vaccinations. And we've had a number of vaccine trial data read out over the last several weeks. 2 vaccine clinical trials have given their final phase 3 data. Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna. These are both mRNA vaccines. We've talked about those in that concept in previous videos. And in both cases, their efficacy numbers are 94, 95%. Really high. And this efficacy seems to be consistent across multiple age groups and across multiple ethnicities and both genders. So that's really positive data. There are side effects from this. These are 2-dose vaccines, and they include things like muscle and bone fatigue, weakness and fever. You basically feel kind of blah after you've had each of these 2 doses. But they have now applied to the FDA for emergency use authorization and approval. And we should see those meetings to discuss that happening within the next couple of weeks. The third vaccine that provided interim phase 3 clinical trial data is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. That's an adenovirus-based vaccine, so it's a different technology. And their data are a little head-scratching. It also is a 2-dose vaccine, and they found that when they gave the first dose at full strength, that they actually only had about a 62% efficacy. But when they gave the first dose at half strength, which was actually a dosing mistake that wasn't caught until after several thousand people had been given half the full dose, those individuals had a much higher efficacy, 90%. So the science behind that is not fully understood, and AstraZeneca recently announced they're going to do additional rounds of testing and analysis to try to better understand that. So we're a ways away from seeing them complete their clinical trials. And then we also expect that later on in December, we'll see Johnson & Johnson give us their interim phase 3 data. Now, interestingly, the AstraZeneca vaccine, they were able to test both for the presence of symptomatic and asymptomatic COVID. Moderna and Pfizer were only able to look at symptomatic, but AstraZeneca followed a different pathway. And their data suggests that even at the lower efficacy, there is protection both for symptomatic and asymptomatic. So we definitely want to keep an eye on that. So now let's transition from approval of vaccines to the distribution of the vaccines. How will that be distributed literally within days of approval? How will that be given from state to state, and what are the individuals that will be first in line? So the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, that's a mouthful, this week gave their recommendation for who should be first in line. These are group 1A categories. And their top priority goes to healthcare workers, about 21 million of those in the United States, and residents and staff in long-term care facilities like retirement centers and nursing home. About 3 million individuals are in that category. So those two groups together equal 24 million Americans, and that's right about the number of doses that we expect to be available if Moderna and Pfizer's vaccines are approved. So we would expect that within the first few weeks, those doses would be entirely used by these groups. This committee will meet again soon and then make recommendations about what comes after that. All right, some updates on therapy findings. So 2 articles that were published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine disappointingly found that neither convalescent plasma nor hydroxychloroquine had benefit in preventing the onset of COVID-19 or in minimizing clinical impacts, clinical outcomes. And this actually joins a growing body of data that suggests that if these are beneficial, that benefit is limited or may be only in specific use cases. On the flip side, based on strong data, the FDA recently approved monoclonal antibodies. So these are lab-generated antibodies, not the mixture of antibodies you get in the plasma from people who have recovered. But they've recently approved for emergency use authorization Regeneron's monoclonal antibodies and Eli Lilly. And these are used in mild to moderate adults and moderate to severe impacts of COVID-19 in children. Okay, last but not least, some good news about the likelihood of being reinfected if you've already had COVID-19. A study from Oxford University looking at healthcare workers who had been infected earlier in the pandemic found that 6 months after their first infection, very, very few of them were actually getting reinfected, that the likelihood of reinfection was highly unlikely at 6 months out. And it's possible that as we continue to study these individuals, we'll find that protection following on that 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 months. A similar study from La Jolla Institute for Immunology found that our immune system, different aspects of our immune system, were able to recognize and respond to the virus even 8 months out from the initial exposure. That also is good news in thinking about the amount of protection that we might get from the vaccine. Okay, lots of content covered pretty quickly. I hope you find this useful. Please feel free to share this with people that you think might also benefit. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Shareable Science Beyond the Blog. Take care.